than this kind of system. And I think it was precisely because of the frustrations posed by the overt political process that literally from one day to the next, down from, I suspect, the President's office, came a whole different kind of
Chris,
vision.
could I ask you just to focus on the question, because I know there's lots of other people who are trying to ask.
Okay, so my question is really, if there are multiple policy processes going on, often in parallel, yeah, surely one of the priorities in all of these things is to how do we, in your co-creation concept, move towards getting a unified, policy process to avoid that in the future. Okay.
Thank you. There's a question at the back.
Hi, it's Henry Kippen from the 2020 Public Services Hub over at the RSA. And I had two quick things to say. One was a reflection and the other's a question, really. In terms of a reflection, I was involved in a discussion this morning at the Department of Communities and Local Government about the big society and about, when I say involved with, I wasn't actually there, somebody told me about it, so this is second-hand information, but full of kind of a very vibrant discussion, lots of ideas about the big society. Are you up for it? Yes, we're up for it. Are you going to invert this relationship between citizens, public services and the state? Yeah, we're up for that too. Brilliant. Let's go. We're all in it. Let's do it. So what do we do? So your journey that you've all articulated from ideas through strategy, through planning to action, I think, everybody's always looking for ideas about how you can do that better. So lessons from the developing world, very welcome here in the UK. And the second point was about the role of resistance. And this relates to this country as it relates to Zambia, as Tanzania, as lots of other places in the developing world. And the risks of innovation that you've talked about in the public sector, for sure, are quite often the risks of what the impact of changes might have on populations. And seeing as we're kind of undergoing now our own sort of self-imposed structural adjustment, we're going to get a different kind of community mobilization, community engagement going on, which is around perhaps resistance rather than co-option in the delivery of services. So I wondered whether, and that's kind of an interesting thing to reflect on because it is about mobilizing people. And is there a role in these kind of models, the kind of model that Christian, you talked about, where you can kind of constructively co-opt that kind of engagement rather than it just being anti what's going on?
Hi, Alan Edwards. I'm the International Director of CITFA, the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accounting. I wonder if I could be cheeky and suggest a fourth P, Paul, to your list. My fourth P is about professionalisation, and it seems to me that if you're going to tackle the other three, actually you need to leave behind a cadre of professionals who can actually deliver prioritisation, planning and performance management. And if I think back to Tony Blair's time in Number 10, for example, and the delivery of the Number 10 delivery unit, which really had a big impact on how we actually delivered public services in this country. It seems to me that improving professionalisation of, in our case, of course, accountants, where we're doing a substantial amount of training in Africa, for example, in Lesotho, where we're leaving behind 300 or so new accountants who can actually deliver prioritisation, planning, performance management. And just to tie it back to innovation, one of the great indicators of professionals is that they learn from best practice and innovation, and so therefore leaving professionals behind seems to me a really important aspect of what we should be doing.
I'll take one more question there and then we'll come back to the panel.
Thank you. John Wilkins with the Commonwealth Secretariat. I'd like to comment on one of the 4 C's and all 3 P's. And I think it all in the context of capacity. The idea of co-creation, I think that the premise is that there's trust and that you can find trusted partners to work with, or that you acknowledge there is trust. And I think that's an ingredient in post-conflict states that is fleeting at best, and in the public service, difficult to attain without real consideration of the people part of being a public servant and valuing those people. On the 3 Ps, priority, I think, is a derivative of having a very clear vision, but it can't be just any vision. It has to be the country's, it has to be owned by the country, and it has to be, as expressed by the President or the Prime Minister in that country, something that they want to work on, not what somebody else wants them to work on. And there's a clear point here in setting priorities that you're not working on other people's priorities, but the ones that are own. And the second P on planning, not just planning in a comprehensive way. I think what I'm hearing out of this discussion is a need to focus on small, manageable projects, even where planning skills can be put to bear and produce some quick victories in some cases, but also sustainable results. If we focus on systemic change all the time, not much will get done. But if we can take pieces of the puzzle and develop momentum, that can generate lasting results. And the third P, which is really a difficult one, and that is managing performance in a context sometimes where accountability is difficult to ascertain or is not embraced as a value, is very difficult. So what that puts the onus on is that if you're going to enter into a performance contract, there have to be real consequences of either meeting or exceeding the performance or not. And consequences have to be made culturally relevant and also achievable in the context. Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate any comments on those points.
Okay, I'll go back to the panel at this point. If we can keep your comments quite short at this stage, because otherwise we're not going to have time for a round for another set of questions. But Christian, can I ask you to respond to some of those? Probably not time to respond to all
Certainly.
of them.
Let me address those, excuse me, those that I think I have something meaningful to say about. The first one that was addressed about the multiple policy processes, that's very true, I'm sure, of developing countries. It's also very true of OECD countries. I mean, there are, in each agency, in each department has its own policy process, and is usually not aligned necessarily with what the Prime Minister wants or what other agencies are doing. And what we're seeing, to give you an example, in Denmark, we're helping our colleagues plan for the EU presidency, which Denmark holds next year. And that is about prioritization. What is going to be on the agenda for a high-level meeting of ministers from 27 EU countries? And we run workshops at MindLab as a platform for collaboration where we help our colleagues across a number of departments prioritize. And that requires some trust, and it requires a process of preparation and of intelligent inputs. And then, of course, at the end of the day, there will be bargaining and there will be negotiations. But I think we have to introduce some spaces and some processes where we can collaborate with each other about finding ways of joining those streams, of finding a way of prioritizing. So that's one point. Then about the point from the RSA, I was actually at the communities department yesterday as well, and we talked about the big society there. I think to get engagement and also to get aspiration about what can be achieved and to overcome perhaps resistance of the typical organizational resistance. I think one of the things we're doing at MindLab that is helping is helping our colleagues see for themselves what are the implications of what we're doing. Experiencing for ourselves, what does it mean to run a business? What does it mean to be, one of the projects we're doing right now, what does it mean to be an Indian engineer arriving in Copenhagen in the snow in December a couple of years ago with his family and trying to build a life and a job for himself. And so when we're developing policies to attract and retain highly qualified engineers and others from abroad, what does it actually mean? Because what we want to build among our colleagues across, in this case, 5 or 6 different departments, is this empathy and this recognition of who are the people we're dealing with, and how can we help? How can we make this work together? Then to the P's and the C's, I think. There was a point about professionalization. I think that's very true. Just to add to that what we're trying to do in building innovation capacity really is to professionalize the practice of innovation within public organizations. So at MindLab, for instance, we run training courses for our colleagues across departments. We build toolboxes and methods and so on that are downloadable and easily accessible. We try to remove all the barriers to working professionally, systematically, in a sustained manner with innovation. Then we spoke a little bit about trust. I think trust is something that is not necessarily a static entity. It's something that can be built and can be shaped, and it probably takes a long time to do that. But I think that if we can even just introduce spaces or occasions of trust, just for a moment sometimes, within public organizations, then we can build on that. And so Mind Lab, as you could see, is a physical space as well. It is a physical space that is not owned by one single department. So when you enter Mind Lab and some of the other innovation units around the world, these are spaces that are dedicated to having a focused effort in a trusting environment, and where we take away the cell phones, we take away all the day-to-day routines, and we sort of try to focus on the task. Now, that is not solving everything at all, but it is just introducing a creative platform, if you will, or a space for a period of time. Finally, this question of consequences, and there were the 3 Ps, and there's the performance management aspect, and actually performance management is something that's really important, and I write about that in the book as well, because that is not just a fact in many organizations, it's something that can underpin and help drive innovation, or the opposite. But I agree that if performance, which is really the result of innovation, I mean, high performance should be the result of what we're trying to do with innovation. If it is not achieved, it should have consequences. And give you an example where it doesn't, from an OECD country, in Denmark, after we had a relatively failed police reform. It's going better now, but it was considered a failure in the public. A year later, the police commissioner received a major bonus. And of course, the press didn't really understand how is it possible to fail a change effort on the one hand, and then on the other hand receive a bonus. And of course, it's because of the contract, but also because what happens, I think, in many bureaucracies is you have routines. And if the routine is that people get a bonus at the end of the year, that will be the routine, actually irrespective of whatever metrics might be in the performance contract.
Thank you. Cool.
I'll just come back on 2 things. On the 4th P, the short answer is you can't have it. The reason you can't have it, though, is that I absolutely agree it's crucial. I guess what I was focusing on were the capacities, and I think what your question speaks to is how are those capacities embodied? And it will shock you to learn that we have an answer to that, which is the 3 S's, which are skills, structures, and systems. And I think you spoke about professionalization in the context of skills, and I think that's right. I think it's also important to note that these things are embodied sometimes in structures, new organizations. You talked about PMDU here. President Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia set up a program delivery unit in her office, which has a similar sort of function, which we're trying to support there. And systems around not just how individual institutions work, but how they're linked together are all critical parts of how these 3 Ps come together. So I completely agree. Picking up this point about they have to be owned priorities, I think that's absolutely right. I would go further. I would say if they're not owned, they're not priorities. They might be priorities as you put it in the sort of formal process, but that doesn't actually matter if what is really affecting behaviours is some informal process hidden from the view. I should emphasise, therefore, that from our point of view, we don't advise on what the priorities should be. We don't have a kind of technical advice on you should do education, you should do this, you should do that. What we're trying to do is think through the actual process of prioritisation itself and trying to think about how some of these multiple processes for prioritisation get linked together. So in Rwanda, for example, trying to think about how the Kivu leadership retreat process gets more synchronized with the sort of budget setting process, the one being much more political, the other being much more donor-based. Can you bring those together so that they're more in sync?
Thank you.
Just very quickly on a couple of points. The first of all about the piecemeal versus systemic. The one, I suppose, counter-argument to that might be in terms of an area such as sort of public finance and budgeting, where there are arguments actually for looking at the whole of the system, not overcomplicating it, but recognising that a sort of well-made budget badly executed is not beneficial, or that a budget that is executed but bears no relationship to a good planning or policy process. So I think a lot of the thinking at the moment is around actually how do you strengthen the whole bit of that cycle. And equally, there is a danger of separating out piecemeal and giving different responsibility for assisting on those pieces, which brings in different models and different practices, and then the two don't link up. On the professionalisation, again, in terms of public finance thinking, it's being touted as one of the missing ingredients in that black box of how do you get public finance reforms to happen. And I know there's a stronger evidence base in accounting and auditing areas where there are strong professional associations, and particularly on the auditing side, I know increasingly on the accounting side. So my understanding is that the jury's still out on whether there's a strong evidence base for it, but it's one of the best sort of ideas we have on the way forward. And just a very quick point, this idea of bringing people together, overcoming resistance. At a level up, there's an argument again in finance that how you view the budget process is actually, that's a sort of negotiated bargaining position between different interests. It may not be particularly policy rich to start with, but at least it's a structured process, and particularly in some of these post-conflict contexts, that might be an interesting way of viewing a technical, what looks like a set of technical disciplines, but actually in a deliberately sort of political and politicised environment.
Thank you. Okay, some time for a few more questions. Yeah. It's also for the people on the web. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Indiana Minto-Coy. I'm here from the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, which is based in Jamaica, so I've traveled quite some time. I just want to firstly take up on a point that the last presenter made about the nature of innovation. Because what I've seen in the case of developing countries is that many innovative policies that are that originate in developed countries get transposed into developing countries. And the irony of this is by the time they get implemented, it's no longer innovative. Yeah. Things have passed, sure. And it's at the stage of being rejected in the developed world, but yet the developing world is intended or expected to implement these policies. A question to Christian, or a point, is, and it's a pity I came in late, so I didn't hear the first bit of your presentation, but to what extent does the notion of co-creation anticipate or assumes that there are certain features or characteristics in a society which would make this process viable? And it can apply to different levels. If you look at the level of the public sector internally, we have budget cuts. Departments are essentially vying for public funds. So the issue of co-creation there may be contentious. If you put it at the level of the society as a whole, and you look at the public, the private, and the civil society, there may be issues there again. And we've seen these time and time again in developing countries, which would make co-creation a timely, costly process. If you look at it in an international development context, there is the issue of development agencies working with national governments, and the whole issue of different ambitions, different views, different culture, different expectations, and the kind of challenges or dilemmas that brings up when it comes, when the international policies or the policies of the development agencies meet with the local agenda.
Can I I'm trying to get some more. Can we leave it there?
So
That was a good comment and a good question. Okay, if people can keep it to the questions, I think that will help get more out of us. To here and then there.
Hi, Davis Cook. I'm a consultant for South African government on innovation policy. I've just got two questions around kind of leadership aspects of it, which is that certainly in developing countries, a lot of these strategies are driven by individuals. And I'm curious to hear your comments on how you embed that in a system in what are sometimes some very fluid political movements. The second thing following on from that is that a lot of the time the leadership and authority around implementing these kind of strategies doesn't sit at the national government level, such as with the ministers, but sits at lower levels of government. And I mean, if it's fluid at the national level, it's somewhat turbulent at the lower government level. So what advice would you have around embedding it within a system over a longer period of time rather than having it driven by particular individuals?
My name's Kathy Ted, and my question's really directed towards Christian. I was interested that the idea of the importance of context seemed to have been basically subsumed within capacity in the way that you presented it. I haven't read the book as a caveat to that. And I'm interested about that because it seems that context is very heavily emphasised, particularly in the academic community, both in the UK, if we think about like Jean Hartley's work on health service reform, or recently DFID's been commissioning review work on public sector and governance reform overseas, and context is repeatedly emphasised as affecting outcomes, and that's a barrier to generalising lessons. So I'd be interested in having your comments on that. Also, I really liked the contrast between that local specific detail and then the sort of wider view. But I just wanted to say that I think within that wider view, it's worth taking it way back to what do people think the functions of government should be in developing country context. I think I worked for the government of Southern Sudan for a couple of years, and I think there is still a debate about what the right functions of that government should be. And there's an argument that, you know, around the peace dividend and what the government's doing by employing a large number of people, for example, in that. The very final point, and this is to everyone, and I know that you've been treating them humorously, but I'd say be careful on the use of acronyms, because sometimes you end up with words which are not quite what you're describing. So I'm not sure about the use of the word consciousness, for example, for what you were describing there. So don't worry about C's and P's and S's. Go for what you mean.
How will we remember it, Kathy? How will we remember it?
Okay.
Write it down.
Okay, thank you. Over to the panel, chance just to respond to that and any sort of final words you want to say.
Sure. All right, let me jump into it. So there was the question about the assumptions of co-creation behind it, and really also the question of time and cost. I think we heard the example of someone a leader in government spending 95% of his or her time not on priorities. My experience is that that we really invest very, very little of our time in what you might call innovation or in creating the futures we want in public organizations. And we spend a lot of time, not just in meetings, but we spend a lot of time on the daily running of the business. And yes, that is, of course, the stability and legitimacy of government is also stable operations. However, if change is a constant, then the question is, are we investing sufficiently in dealing with change? And the second point about it is really that the practices and approaches we're talking about here are not expensive. Compared to the amount of money spent on surveys, quantitative, huge surveys, and I know how expensive they can be in remote areas or in countries with difficult communication channels. I mean, these are very small scale. We're talking about involving 8 to 12 citizens sometimes in a process, relatively rapid processes. This is about simply meeting with each other across levels of government in a different way. So I'm not talking about something that is more costs more resources, but which I think is much more effective in bringing about understanding what change is needed and how to do it. Then I want to go to Kathy's excellent questions. Yes, context is really important. I think when I write about context in the book, it's really about the political settings and I mean understanding what is simply the political legislative framework we're in and what are the opportunities there, and to what extent are the political contexts helping or promoting innovation, and to what extent are there barriers and challenges, for instance, in the way legislation is set up. And we have to be aware of that. That is part of working with innovation in democratic organizations rather than working with innovation in private firms. Then there's the question about the systems view and how we move all the way back to the question of the fundamental functions or roles of government. And in fact, that is what I was mentioning is happening in some Danish agencies, that we have large organizations asking themselves the question, why are we here? Why are we here? What are we doing? And might we be much, much more effective, and might our mission be much more meaningful if we fundamentally redefined the relationship between what we are doing and what citizens need? And I think it's very, very fundamental. And what I can see from our work in the last 9 years in MindLab is that we're finally coming to the recognition that the best and most powerful driver of innovation is insight into the fundamental relationship between system and, if you will, society or citizens, and that is the driver of innovation. And finally, thank you for the point about acronyms. I can tell you there were a lot more of them in the book before it was edited. So you've just seen the top of the iceberg.
Cool.
I'll just pick up one question. I think was it David? David. I think that's a fascinating question, which was around how do you embed this in systems and not just in individuals. I think it actually relates quite closely to the exchange that John and Ed had around, do you go for sort of small, quick wins or try and attempt the systemic stuff? And at the risk of sounding like a mini-me of our patron, I think you need to find a third way. Because it does seem to me that what we know is that sort of neither approach has a great track record of success. Just focusing on individuals too heavily or focusing too much on just getting the thing done has a tendency to sort of leave no capacity behind whatsoever. Equally, focusing on the huge systemic changes has a tendency to not ever generate any of the momentum or political buy-in that you need for that sort of change to happen. So what we are, I guess, sort of grappling with is what does that sort of space in the middle look like? And I don't want to sort of say that we've got the answers yet, but I can at least say what we think the answer might look like. And I guess that's to walk in the shoes of the leaders, because what we know is that things won't happen without their buy-in. We need to start with the dilemma they face, which is how do I get this deliverable that I'm interested in to actually happen, and work back from that deliverable to the sorts of capacities which are not only going to be can enable them to get that thing done, but to get the next thing done. So rather than focusing on just some, sending in a kind of crack team to get the thing done and then they all leave, think about what are those 3 S's, those systems, those skills, those structures, which are needed not just to deliver this free healthcare initiative for this time round, but which next time there's a health priority, whether that's vaccination programs or whatever, are still fundamentally important. So you need to really think carefully about what are the, as it were, binding capacity constraints, not just for this program, but for all programs, and focus your efforts on them. That's at least what we're trying to do at AGI. I'm always open to kind of conversing with people who've got experiences of similar sorts of efforts elsewhere, because I think all of us in this sort of space are grappling with that dilemma.
Thank you. Anna?
I'll just respond to the point that was posed. We'll perhaps link it up with a context question about innovations transposed and whether they're relevant. I think the point I would make on that is if innovations that are developed here and don't succeed are transplanted, then there's absolutely greater attention needs to be what's being transposed. However, maybe the more pertinent question is whether it's successful here or not, is it relevant for the context in which you're putting, which I think brings in the context question. And to some extent, its success or otherwise here is incidental to its relevant application there and the way in which you would develop and redesign. And I think this brings it quite nicely to the point about where does the innovation originate from, or at least what's the balance of the relationship in innovation. And if we're thinking too much our models experimenting there, then I think we're missing something quite important.
Thank you. Well, look, thank you very much indeed. It's been an extraordinary conversation ranging on a whole range of issues as well as countries. I mean, the 2 things that I take away from this very strongly, first of all, a real encouragement about the getting close point, that actually going back and talking and working with citizens and working with people to find out what's actually needed and what's going to impact. And there's a lot of development that's about that already, but whether it's Voices for Poor, whether it's participatory poverty assessments, whether it's how you go and produce your national poverty strategies, and the idea of and the issue of the empathy and the peer learning as well, I think it's really good reminders about that. And I think a lot of us are working on that. But I also think you've given us a really helpful roadmap and ideas about what we can do on change, and basically how change needs to be supported. It's not going to happen. And it could be supported whether it's through ideas about, think about doing this as a co-creation, as a co-production event. And it's just a different kind of, concept, if you like, for how we tackle it. Or it can still be about the issue of how do you worry about prioritisation, because that actually is an acute problem, more acute probably than most of the developing countries are working in than it even is here. And how do you actually do that, and how do you work around that? And I think finally we've heard a lot about how you actually build the capacity around that to support the change both now and also in the longer term. So getting close and supporting change have been two really big takeaways for me here. Thank you very much. You've given us a very rich menu to feast on for now and for future. I think you'll be around for a bit longer if people want to come up. And if you want to know more or find out details about the book, I'm sure we're putting it on the website and a link across to do that. And also a link if people want to know more about AGI as well. Very happy to link up on that. But thank you very much, Dee, for coming. And thank you, the panel, for giving us such a good time. Thank you.